The 1950s were the golden age of America, a time of roaring V8 engines and proud tail-fin designs. But gentlemen, not every blueprint that came out of Detroit was a masterpiece. In truth, hidden behind those glamorous Cadillacs and chrome-laden Chevrolets were a few designs that probably should have been torn up right on the drafting table. Today, music. We're going to reopen one of the darker case files in automotive history and take a look at 12 of the most disastrous cars of the 1950s in America. Machines so bizarre, so cobbled together, and sometimes so downright ridiculous that you can't help but wonder, what exactly were the executives of those car companies drinking during office hours back then? 1958, Ford Edel. In 1958, inside Ford's gleaming glass conference rooms in Detroit, a project was unveiled with almost absolute confidence. They called it the Edsel, a car promoted as the future of the American automobile industry, the result of millions of dollars in market research and years of preparation. The advertising campaigns were so massive that even before its official debut, the public had been led to believe that a 4W-wheeled revolution was about to roll off the assembly line. But when the curtain was finally pulled back, what appeared before buyers left many of them standing silent for a few seconds. The enormous vertical grille made the car look so strange that the design team called it a horse collar, while the public quickly mocked it, saying it looked exactly like an Oldsmobile sucking on a lemon. Controversial styling aside, the real trouble with the Edsel lay deeper right inside the cockpit. Ford decided to equip the car with the Teletouch shifting system, a row of push music buttons placed right in the center of the steering wheel, exactly where the horn was supposed to be. In tense moments on the road, many drivers instinctively pressed the center of the wheel and accidentally shifted the car straight into reverse. Transmissions broke, drivers panicked, music, and the reputation of the Edsel collapsed quickly. Released just as the American economy was slipping into recession with a high price tag and sloppy assembly quality, the Edsel soon became an expensive business lesson. 1953 Hudson Jet. In the early 1950s, Hudson still carried a respectable reputation. Hudson cars with the famous step-down design were known for their low center of gravity, excellent road grip, and impressive performance on NASCAR tracks. These were the kinds of cars that made many American gentlemen proud when they pressed the accelerator on the highway. But then, in a decision that many engineers would later shake their heads at in disbelief, company president A.E. Barrett became convinced that the future lay in a compact car. The original idea sounded reasonable, a fuel-efficient compact car designed to compete in a growing segment. But Mr. Barrett added a rather unusual requirement. He insisted that the roof had to be tall enough for a gentleman to wear his fedora while driving. At the same time, in an effort to save money, many components from larger cars were forced to fit into the smaller body. The result was a strange shape, a narrow body, but unusually tall, looking almost like a mobile phone booth mounted on 4 tiny wheels. But the problem wasn't just the appearance. Hudson had once been famous for its confident cornering. Yet, the Jet was the complete opposite. Heavy to drive, poorly balanced, and completely lacking the sporting spirit the brand had built its reputation on. Development costs soared, sales disappointed. Music and the Hudson Jet ultimately became one of the missteps that pushed this once glorious automaker closer to the point where merging with another company became its only chance to survive. 1950. Kaiser Henry J. In the early 1950s, businessman Henry J. Kaiser carried a rather noble ambition to build the cheapest car in America, so that working-class families could afford a vehicle of their own. After World War II, millions of American families were striving to step into middle-class life, and Kaiser believed that a simple, affordable car could open that door. But between cheap and cheaply made lies a gap that this car never managed to cross. To cut costs, Chrysler removed almost everything that could be considered unnecessary. The earliest versions didn't even have a trunk. If you wanted to carry luggage, you had to fold the rear seat and shove your belongings through the cabin. There was no glove box for the passenger, and the rear window was even welded shut, unable to open. Inside, everything felt stripped down and crude. As the car rolled down the road, the body rattled like an empty oil drum bouncing across the pavement. The price of the Henry J may have been low, but American men at the time had another option. They would rather buy a decent used Chevrolet than drive a car that made them feel like they were accepting an embarrassing compromise. 1957, Plymouth Belvedere Fury line. In 1957, Chrysler introduced an entirely new line of Plymouth cars carrying the bold design language of designer Virgil Exner. The advertising campaign proudly proclaimed the slogan, "Suddenly, it's 1960," as if the future had arrived 3 years early. And indeed, when the Plymouth Belvedere and Fury rolled out of the showroom, people had to admit they looked like something from another decade. The bodies were long, low, and razor-sharp, with pointed tail fins stretching out behind like the wings of a fighter jet, making the car appear fast, even when it was standing still. But that beauty, unfortunately, was like a rose that bloomed too quickly. Ganz cool. In order to rush the forward-look design to market ahead of competitors from GM and Ford, Chrysler pushed its factories to work at an almost frantic pace. The result was cars leaving the assembly line with alarmingly poor quality. Rainwater leaked into the cabin, forming puddles beneath the floor mats. The body panels were made from steel, so thin that many cars began rusting while they were still sitting on the dealer lot. Even worse, the torsion bars of the suspension system, once a point of engineering pride for Chrysler, sometimes snapped while the car was out on the road. And so, for many Plymouth owners in 1957, the slogan, "Suddenly, it's 1960," seemed to deserve a more bitter revision. Suddenly, your brand new car is already falling apart. 1958 Packard Hawk. In 1958, after a difficult merger with Studebaker, this once glorious brand was already in a state that could only be described as near death. Development funds had nearly dried up, and the leadership was left with only one desperate option: keep the Packard name alive at any cost. The result of that desperation was the 1958 Packard Hawk. Instead of being a completely new model, it was essentially a Studebaker Golden Hawk that had been dressed up to carry the Packard badge. The front end was fitted with an extended fiberglass nose jutting forward, looking almost like the wide-open mouth of a giant catfish hovering over the road. To create a sense of luxury, the manufacturer even wrapped faux leather over padded sections mounted on the outside of the doors. For Packard's loyal customers, it was almost a shock. They had been accustomed to refined, dignified luxury sedans. But now, standing before them, was a car hastily assembled, oddly styled, and carrying almost none of the identity that had once defined the Packard name. 1955 Dodge Lam. In the mid-music 1950s, advertising executives believed the market was missing one thing: a car designed specifically for women. And so, in 1955, Dodge introduced a model with a distinctly feminine name, Lam. At first glance, the car looked like a pink dream straight out of a fashion magazine. The body was painted in two-tone colors with rather poetic names: Heather Rose and Sapphire White. The interior was no less distinctive. Inside the car came a pink umbrella, a pink raincoat, a matching bonnet, and even a specially designed handbag, complete with compartments for cosmetics and a built-in vanity mirror. But the problem was this: no one actually wanted the car. American men obviously had no intention of driving something so heavily styled in pink, while many women felt the idea was patronizing and unrealistic. Women in the 1950s needed a dependable car to go to work, run errands, or take their kids to school, not a rolling makeup room on four wheels. And so, the Dodge LFM quickly became something of a joke in the advertising world before quietly fading away into the margins of automotive history. 1953 to 1954 Chevrolet Corvette. When General Motors first introduced the Corvette in 1953, many believed America had finally found its answer to the small European sports cars that were beginning to pour into the market. Names like Jaguar and MG were already capturing the curiosity of American car enthusiasts, and GM wanted to prove that Detroit could build a stylish roadster of its own. And it must be said that when the first Corvette appeared under the bright lights of the auto show, it truly looked impressive. Its glossy fiberglass body, clean convertible top, and flowing lines made it look like a machine born to sprint down the coastal highways of California. But that beautiful exterior hid a rather disappointing truth. Under the hood was not the powerful engine one would expect from a sports car, but merely the Blue Flame inline six-cylinder engine borrowed from Chevrolet's light trucks. That modest power plant was paired with a two-speed Powerglide automatic transmission, which shifted so slowly that many drivers felt the car was almost hesitating every time they pressed the accelerator. The result was a rather ironic paradox: a sports car that looked incredibly fast, yet could be left behind by ordinary family sedans the moment the traffic light turned green. To make matters worse, many early Corvettes suffered from irritating issues such as doors popping open during hard cornering, or the fabric roof leaking when it rained. It took several more years before GM finally equipped the Corvette with a true V8 engine, and only then did the reputation of this model begin to recover. 1956 Renault Dauphine. As American cars grew larger, more powerful, and increasingly dominated by V8 engines, one European automaker had a completely different idea. Renault believed that Americans might also develop an interest in smaller cars, vehicles that were fuel-efficient and easier to maneuver in city streets. And so, the Renault Dauphine was introduced to the American market with hopes of repeating the success that the Volkswagen Beetle was beginning to build. At first glance, this little carried a certain French charm. Its soft, rounded design, rear-mounted engine, and compact size made it look rather elegant among Detroit's gigantic sedans. But its tiny engine was so weak that the car needed about 32 seconds to reach 60 mph. In that amount of time, an American driver could almost finish a cup of coffee before the car finally reached a speed fast enough to merge into traffic. But the biggest problem lay in the body itself. Thin steel and poor corrosion resistance quickly made the car a victim of the harsh winters in the northern states. Road salt and moisture caused many Dauphines to rust so quickly that American mechanics at the time often joked that the car seemed to be made from a material that could dissolve in water. And after only a few winters, many Dauphines had already turned into quiet piles of orange metal sitting in junkyards. 1957, Studebaker Scotsman. By the late 1950s, a company that had once been one of the oldest automobile manufacturers in America was now struggling with declining sales and rising production costs weighing heavily on its shoulders. In a desperate attempt to survive the recession, Studebaker decided to release a car so inexpensive that nearly everything possible was stripped away. That carried a very simple name: the 1957 Studebaker Scotsman. At first glance, the Scotsman made its philosophy immediately clear: remove everything possible. There were no gleaming chrome strips like those on its competitors of the time. The wheel covers were simply painted instead of being plated in metal. Inside the cabin, many interior details were made from materials so cheap that they looked more like cardboard than the trim of an automobile. But the most memorable detail of the Scotsman lay in its windshield wiper system. Instead of using an electric motor, the car relied on vacuum-operated wipers. That meant when you press the accelerator to speed up or pass another car, exactly when you most needed clear visibility in the rain, the vacuum dropped and the wipers nearly stopped moving. Driving a Scotsman in bad weather therefore became an experience that was both dangerous and deeply frustrating. 1952, Sears Allstate. This was a company famous for its mail-order catalogs, where Americans could buy almost anything from washing machines and gardening tools to even prefabricated houses. And then, one day, someone in a boardroom asked a rather unusual question. If people could buy a lawnmower through a catalog, then why couldn't they also buy a car? From that idea, the 1952 Sears Allstate was born. In reality, the car was not an entirely new design. It was essentially the slow-selling Kaiser Henry J, renamed, fitted with the Allstate badge, and equipped with tires, spark plugs, and several other parts carrying the Sears brand. But the biggest problem wasn't the car itself. It was the way it was sold. Customers could purchase an Allstate at a Sears department store. But when the car developed problems, which was hardly uncommon, many traditional auto dealerships refused to service it. And for many American men at the time, telling the neighbors that they had just bought a car from a display area sitting between the washing machines and the men's underwear section was a rather difficult idea to swallow. And so the Allstate quickly became one of the strangest retail experiments in American automotive history. 1954 Nash Metropolitan. In the mid-1950s, Nash had a rather interesting idea to create a compact car designed for short trips around the city. A car small enough to slip through crowded streets, yet economical enough for grocery runs or casual weekend drives. Music. From that idea, the 1954 Nash Metropolitan was born. From a distance, the Metropolitan looked rather charming, almost like an oversized toy. Its body was rounded and petite, with the front wheels partially covered by metal fender skirts, a detail that reminded many people of the bumper cars at a carnival. But behind that playful appearance were several fairly serious problems. Once the car ventured beyond the city environment, the small engine made the car struggle when driving at high speeds on the highway. The body was short, but relatively tall, creating a worrying sense of instability when the car accelerated. And despite its small size, the enclosed front wheels oddly gave the Metropolitan a surprisingly wide turning radius. Its 3-speed transmission also felt loose, and many drivers at the time described shifting gears as feeling like stirring a spoon in a bucket full of gravel. 1950 Crossley. In the early music 1950s, businessman Powell Crossley Jr. believed that the future of the American automobile industry did not lie in gigantic cars with fuel-hungry V8 engines, but in small, economical, and simple vehicles. While Detroit was racing to build cars that were bigger and more powerful every year, Crossley chose to move in the exact opposite direction. Music, Crossley cars were tiny, narrow, and lightweight, almost like miniature machines rolling down American streets among the gigantic sedans of the era. But the real nightmare of this car lay under the hood. Crossley equipped it with a very unusual engine called Cobra, short for copper brazed. Instead of being cast from iron like conventional engines, this engine block was constructed from thin steel sheets braced together with copper. On paper, the design was lighter and cheaper to produce. In reality, it became a mechanical disaster. When the cooling system used water containing impurities, an electrochemical reaction occurred between the steel and the copper. Over time, the engine block began to corrode from the inside, creating small holes. Music. And when that happened, a car that had been running normally down the road could suddenly start spraying oil and boiling coolant out of the engine bay. For many Chrysler owners at the time, their car felt less like a vehicle and more like a failed chemistry experiment mistakenly installed inside an automobile. And so, when we look back at the full picture of the 1950s, we can see that the golden age of the American automobile industry was not built solely on majestic Cadillacs or chrome-covered Chevrolets. Hidden behind the bright showroom lights and glamorous advertising campaigns were plenty of misguided decisions, rushed projects, music, and sometimes even the arrogance of Detroit boardrooms. Thank you for joining me on this journey back in time. I'm very curious to know, music, has anyone here ever sat behind the wheel? Or at least had to push one of the cars on this list? Or perhaps you remember another automotive disaster from the 1950s that I may have missed. Share your story in the comments below. And if you enjoy explorations like this into the forgotten corners of Detroit's history, don't forget to hit like and subscribe to the channel. I'll see you in the next video.